This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to announce the release of my new book, Obama's True Legacy, How He Transformed America. There's a reason why Mike Huckabee calls it a ferocious and chilling read. Order it now at Amazon.com or at FrontPageMag.com. Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, another fantastic program with another fantastic guest. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember we're a fan-generated program. We need all the help we can get. And even though Donald Trump is in power, getting rid of the bad guys, we are still being shadow banned and persecuted on many levels. So please help us out. Go to YouTube and Rumble and subscribe to our channels there, the Glazov Gang. Go to jamieglazov.com and subscribe to our newsletter. If you're in a generous mood, please donate to us on jamieglazov.com and help us to keep going. Follow us on X and on Facebook at Jamie Glazov. And most importantly, go to the website liveuptofreedom.com. That is the wonderful Annie Cyrus's website, and she's fighting for liberty around the world. Please follow her and support her. What an honor and privilege it is to have with us this evening Auron MacIntyre. He's a columnist at The Blaze, host of the Auron MacIntyre Show, and the author of the book, The Total State: How Liberal Democracies Become Tyrannies. Auron, what an honor to have you here.
Fantastic to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Auron, read your book. Fascinating work. Also a scary work, but gives us hope. So why don't we just begin? I got lots of questions, but first tell us what inspired you to write it.
Sure. Like a lot of people, I think especially in the United States, I grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh and, hearing about how the separation of powers and all of these things, checks and balances, the Bill of Rights, they were going to control the government. They were going to prevent tyranny. And then we saw what happened during the COVID outbreak. And all of a sudden you couldn't go to church, but the strip clubs were open. You couldn't go see a loved one if they were dying in the hospital, but people were allowed to riot in the streets as long as they were on the side of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden. And all of a sudden I said, okay, well, politics in the United States and perhaps in many countries doesn't work the way that I was taught and the way that I had explained it to many people when I was a teacher and a reporter. And so I wanted to understand more of what was going on. And that kind of sent me on an intellectual journey, reading about different political theorists who had encountered the way that power works in many of these situations. And that's what I tried to do with the book, try to create a scenario where people could better understand what happened, what was going on, and hopefully how we could make changes and ultimately fix that problem.
Thank you, Auron. This is something I've been thinking about since I was a little kid. My parents were dissidents in the Soviet Union. We escaped that hellhole. And you begin your book with Genesis, about the Tower of Babel. And that means a lot to me. And I think those of us who understand perhaps also or see the spiritual war in front of our eyes, that has a lot of meaning in there. Could you expand a little bit and tell us why you included that part of Genesis to start the book?
Well, the book is a work of political theory. It's trying to outline many of the material causes that happen that brought us to where we are. But I also recognize that ultimately we are spiritual creatures. We are creations of God, and his word and his truth is woven throughout everything that we do. And so the patterns that are represented in the Bible, they're there to tell us about the past, but they're also there to help us understand the archetypes that dominate human nature. And one of them is the collection and centralization of power. The story we see first, of course, is the Tower of Babel. And that's the one in which all the men of the world are united in a way in which that they're attempting to reach up and touch God, to equal God. And in many ways, that is ultimately what the governments of our nations are trying to do now. They're trying to re-engineer humanity in a way that allows them to become godlike in order to remake man in their own image and control the entire world, when we were indeed designed instead to exist in particular nations as particular peoples governed by our own folkways, traditions, and ways of being. And so I think it's important when we address this issue to, of course, look at the monetary side, look at the power side, the political side, but also to not forget that there is a spiritual truth behind all of this and a motivation that ultimately drives our leaders to where they're going.
Thank you, Warren. And so you very clearly show that despite the beauty of the Constitution of America, because you're definitely not attacking the founding fathers, but you're showing what can happen when a certain class takes power, how weak we can be even with the greatest of institutions that try to defend liberty. And, I studied a lot of American history. And I remember in studying the American Constitution during my grad years, I was fascinated by something. That the founding fathers, when they were preparing the document and, how to frame America, in the correspondence with each other, they were agonizing that this is not going to work unless there is virtue in society. And if virtue disappears, then democracy, quote unquote, and, the republic that's founded on liberty, something can go very left. Could you talk a little bit about that, how important virtue is in the atmosphere of freedom? And I think that's definitely a problem today, and you've also discussed that. If virtue disappears, we can be in a lot of trouble even though we might have a good foundation with a good constitution, right?
Yeah, I fear that many people conflate freedom and liberty, and they treat them as exactly the same thing. And I think there's an important distinction to be made. Our founders were interested in ensuring liberty for themselves and their posterity, but they knew that liberty was the fruit of virtue, that it was people who understood the good and were living their lives oriented in the direction of the good and the beautiful and true. They were ultimately free. A heroin addict is free in the sense that he can do all the drugs he wants, and maybe he won't go to jail if you have a more libertarian society. But he's not experiencing true liberty, ordered liberty, which is being oriented towards the good in a society where you understand your role, where you're fulfilling your duty to yourself, your family, your community. This is truly what defines liberty in the classical sense, and our founding fathers knew that, but unfortunately for many conservatives and libertarians in the United States, they've kind of gotten this backwards. They believe that the Constitution was mainly some kind of mechanical invention, some machine that was set up to perfectly balance these different branches and powers, and that was ultimately what would ensure their freedom to just have basically license, to have vice, to do whatever they'd like. But that was never the intention of the Constitution, and when we understand it in that way, it will of course fail us because we're missing a critical ingredient. As you say, the founders understood that the Constitution was made for a moral and religious people and was unfit to govern any other. And so if we lost those key aspects, then all of the beautiful words and even the mechanisms written into the Constitution itself could not actually restrict the power. The Constitution was simply an instantiation of the beliefs, the traditions, the values of the American people at that time. It's not magical in the sense that it itself holds back power, but what it does is give you a snapshot of what virtuous people were doing in order to sustain their communities and live good lives, and how that enabled them to have small governance because the state did not have to step in and take critical action in areas that today we allow them to have all over the place. And so it's really important for people who are looking at the Constitution not to just treat it as some kind of blueprint for a mechanism, but understand it more as a representation of a particular spirit and approach to governance.
Absolutely. Thank you. Very, very wise. Thank you, Auron. And I think about this, and have been thinking about this my whole life, especially from the context of my family and what communism did to our people. And as you document and showed, because of just what we had gone through in the United States with, people calling on people that aren't wearing a mask and, a million other things, just a really crazy time. that if humans sit back and get too relaxed, there's something that seems to be in nature where people want power and begin to abuse others. And I know this very complicated issue for also those of us. I'm a Christian. I don't want to impose any of my beliefs. Maybe you can talk about your faith, but we know that God is a free agent, and so he wants us to be free. So that's a whole conversation. But Satan hates freedom. And I think a certain argument could be made that that he's behind communism and Nazism and Islam and Islamic gender apartheid and all kinds of those evil entities. And so there's a constant battle there. And I always think about Reagan's quote. Reagan said, freedom is never more than one generation from extinction, and it has to be constantly fought for. And so if we sit back, it's not in the natural state of just that freedom is just going to be there naturally. We have to fight for it constantly. Let me hand that over to you. What do you think about what I just said?
Well, I think that in the United States, we faced a very interesting problem because, of course, as you know, in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany, your totalitarianism was far more upfront, right? You knew where propaganda was coming from. You understood where the state was drawing the line and flexing its power. There were jackboots, there were gulags. We understand this as totalitarianism. But in the United States, it took on a very interesting and different approach. In the United States, our elites wielded soft power, what Machiavelli or Gaetano Mosca would have called the foxes instead of the lions. And our fox-style elites in the West actually turned our desire for freedom against us. They understood that if they could isolate people and manipulate their opinion, then they would be able to decide what democracy looked like. And this is something that Alexis de Tocqueville warned about in Democracy in America, that American individualism, while it had its upsides, its downside is that it could isolate people and leave them open to manipulation. And so for him, for de Tocqueville, the thing that made American democracy work, that made the American Republic function, was the amount of community organizations that grounded the American people. The fact that they were so passionate about their faith and their community that they joined churches and mutual aid societies and guilds and all of these fraternal organizations voluntarily in a way that European civilizations usually did not. And that's what allowed America to operate as a somewhat individualistic society while still having these community bonds that stood strong against larger centralizations of power. But once we broke down those bonds, once we lost the church, we lost the family, once these forces became weaker in the United States, then the state could use that individualism to manipulate us because we didn't have constant contact with our friends, our family, our God, the things that keep us grounded in reality. And so ultimately, we had a different type of totalitarianism come in the back door. One that doesn't come with the jackboots, it doesn't come with the gulags. However, it comes with a large amount of social engineering and manipulation of public opinion. And because we were not connected to those things that make us whole, that make us connected to God and to our families and our communities, we were easily misled into situations in which we believe things like you can't sit on a beach without a mask, without, killing someone. Ridiculous things in hindsight, but at the time, people believed them because the only information they were getting was from their phones or their televisions. They didn't have that grounding in church and family and community that would have set them back to reality.
Absolutely. As the years have been passing, everywhere I look, I'm just thinking, you know what? They don't want us talking to each other. They don't want us getting together. They don't want us talking. So that's very interesting. And it's also very interesting if you have to wear a face covering, what that also does in terms of the inability to communicate with each other and also to see the image of God in each other. So that's another whole conversation. But I'm also very interested in how totalitarians talk about safety. It's for everybody's good. We have to be safe. And so if the totalitarians and despots and tyrants, if they can't do it this way, then they're going to do it this way. If they can't do it this way, guess what? Then it's for the public health. So it's very interesting how totalitarianism can come through the medical industry. Could you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. I think in the modern era, we like to think of ourselves as very enlightened people. We like to think of ourselves as very scientifically minded and advanced. We don't believe in this idea of special knowledge or divine revelation. That's what a lot of people feel in a secular society. But what we've really done is transferred that priestly duty over to what we call experts. And experts exist in all of these fields, especially medical experts, and they have this sacred knowledge that you don't have and you can't challenge because, I mean, do you have a doctorate? Do you have the qualifications? No. So how can you actually speak on this topic? Now, common sense should allow you to push back, but when you've bought into the divine mandate of experts, then you feel silly or stupid. You get shamed as low class or foolish for standing up against them. And so we end up in the scenario where doctors, who we should be able to trust, right? These should be objective actors without agendas. They should be motivated by our own health and well-being. That should be their primary concern. But when the desire for power leaks into this expert class, and this expert class becomes the only class that is allowed to make decisions in their areas, then what we end up is this scenario where we think that we've elected, say, Donald Trump as president of the United States. But when it's time to decide the exception, when it's time to decide what actually happens during the pandemic, it's Anthony Fauci who seems to be in charge. And this is very confusing for people because they say, well, I elected this guy who's supposed to be the head of the country, and yet this expert seems to be the one who's actually calling the shots. But you can't question anything he says because he has this divine revelation of expertise that makes him unassailable. And so this is how you can use secular expertise as a way to create almost a divine authority that allows you to then dictate totalitarian terms. And that's really what we saw over and over again, is even our elected officials were regularly pushed to the side by a class of people who were never elected and never held accountable, but for some reason we're wielding a large amount of power. And I believe much of that power in our modern society comes from our investment in credentialism and expertise, and treating this in the way that an ancient society would have treated the priests of its god.
Well, you talk about this managerial class, and yes, in the Soviet Union, we know, okay, like with Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So they create these utopias where everybody's going to be equal in the Soviet Union and in communist China and North Korea. But there's this nomenclatura that creeps up. And as you're documenting, even in the United States, with our Constitution, with our liberties, if we're not careful and we're not fighting, there's a certain nomenclatura, a certain managerial class that still forms, and we saw it happen just now, as you have shown. But you give us hope in your book, and there is so much hope, because now what we see with Donald Trump coming in, which for somebody like myself is a huge relief, and I haven't stopped celebrating yet. Every day's like Christmas. But the beauty of America is that it seems to correct itself. Even if things are getting out of hand, it corrects itself. And you write about how the total state is doomed, that the total state ultimately collapses under its own weight. It's not sustainable. That's fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we know that the Tower of Babel doesn't stand. It doesn't reach to God. That whether through the sheer mechanics, the physics of the thing, or direct divine intervention, probably a little bit of both. Whenever man attempts to reach these type of heights, ultimately he fails. And one of the huge problems with attempting to coordinate a massive bureaucracy across not just a continent, but at this point, almost a globe-spanning empire in which kind of a larger U.S. influence exists. The problem is that when you try to kind of crush people into this homogenous nature that allows them to be managed at this mass level, you start to do something to the average human. C.S. Lewis called this the abolition of man. the desire to remake, unmake man as God created him and remake him in the image of the expert class, the managerial class. But when you do this, you strip out some of the key aspects of humanity. You strip out ambition, you strip out drive, ingenuity, the things that actually keep a civilization going. Yes, you can manage people like machines, but machines will never do what humans can do. And when you try to apply that strategy to a massive humanity, you fundamentally change something about the way our societies are organized, and they start to break down. And when I wrote the book, this was before Donald Trump came into office. In the book, I was simply pointing out the things that we were already seeing, that we had failures of supply chains, that we had failures of technology. We had a competency crisis, the ability to reliably manage planes in the air, these kind of things, which we've seen, unfortunately, on a regular basis more and more, are a problem for our civilization, specifically because we have injected this false ideology in an attempt to make people more manageable. The bad news is that for a short time, that creates problems. But the good news is that in the long term, it means that this mass managerial total state can't sustain itself. Now, the interesting thing, the thing that I did not necessarily predict in the book, was that Donald Trump has come in with a fire that simply did not exist before. I believe in a very real way that Donald Trump's life was saved by God. And when that happens to you, there's simply that's a moment that forges you in the fire. And I think that while Trump himself is still a man who has of deep flaws and may not have a perfect relationship with God, I think that he is a man who understands the enormity of the situation he's in and the task before him. And we can see from his first few weeks in office a very different Trump than we did last time. Trump did good things in 2016, but this time around, he's very clearly got a important plan, especially one that is focused on dismantling the managerial state itself. You can actually hear Vivek Ramaswamy and J.D. Vance using this exact language. These guys know the authors that I'm pulling from. They've read James Burnham. They know what's happening in the managerial revolution. So when they are going after the administrative state, when they are going after the total state in the United States, they are pulling from the same thinkers that I was when I wrote this book. So they have a firm grasp on the nature of the problem and how to attack it. I couldn't have imagined a class of politician coming in the United States with that kind of background, that kind of understanding, and that kind of drive. And so that is incredibly heartening, because while I predicted that this system would collapse under its own weight, and that possibility still exists, we have now a better outcome possible, where gentlemen who are familiar with what's going on and how to dismantle it can bring this system down and return us to a more constitutional form of governance without having to see the difficulties that would have come with the collapse of the system itself. Ultimately, we might not get there. They might not reach that goal, but the simple fact that they are trying this gargantuan task is incredibly heartening.
Absolutely. I agree with everything you're saying, Auron. A lot of wisdom there, a lot of profound insights. Just maybe adding a little footnote here as I'm watching this, because sometimes I think, wow, just sometimes blessing in disguises. So we all suffered so much those 4 years under Biden. It was almost some kind of perverse, cruel, demonic theater that was torturing us. And but I'm thinking, after everything they did to Trump, some kind of blessing in disguise here, because they tortured him so much, and his eyes were always open, but even more they opened under his suffering, under his persecution. He really saw these demons for who they were, really. And so in the first term, he might want to release the JFK files, but somebody gets on the phone with him and says, oh, no, don't do that. So he goes, all right, I won't do it. But this time around, it's like, no, we're releasing that, and we're releasing this, and we're doing this. So I think that they hurt him so badly and so unjustly that he's really on fire. And in a way, what a blessing it is that he was persecuted, because he ended up seeing the truth and really became a real fighter this time, right?
Yeah, you can see the sea change again in this administration. The first time around, Trump had a team of people around him who believed in his mission, but the swamp, the Republican Party itself, was basically against him. They were hostile to him, and they denied him many of his key picks. They didn't do the senatorial approval process for many of the cabinet positions or different other positions he was trying to get confirmed. And so he ended up in the scenario where he was hobbled. Many of his guys had to resign from different attacks by the media. And so you ended up getting a bunch of John Boltons and other guys in here who just they were not interested in what Donald Trump believed or what his voters wanted. They were just interested in perpetuating the system. This time around, it's very, very different. Look at who's being confirmed, right? Tulsi Gabbard, confirmed. Everyone in the intelligence community hates Tulsi Gabbard. They got her on the no-fly list, right? Same thing with RFK Jr. This is a guy who was specifically crusading against Fauci and his fake vaccine. And you see the way in which the left has pushed back against him, and yet here he is now confirmed. You also see the FBI. Kash Patel is somebody who has been persecuted by corrupt FBI. He knows what this is like. He's seen what the FBI is doing. Every one of these picks is someone who is loyal to Donald Trump and hostile to the organizations that they're being put in charge of. And that's not a mistake, because if you are familiar with these organizations, if you're loyal to these organizations, if you're looking to create a career long-term in these organizations, then maybe you don't listen every time Donald Trump says something. Maybe you try to play ball in order to get ahead and have good relationships when he's out of office. But when you put people like Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel into these positions, you end up with people who have nothing to lose. They know that these positions are important because the institutions are corrupt. They know that they need to cut the rot out of these institutions. They know where it is because it's attacked them personally. And so when they go into this, they are loyal to Trump and they are personally hostile to the organizations that are corrupted. And that's what you need in order to reform or in many cases replace some of them. We've already heard talk about shutting down the Department of Education. As somebody who used to teach in American high schools and public high schools, let me tell you, that is critical because the Department of Education is just poison. Our institutions have done nothing but degrade after the Department of Education was created, and all it does is hoover up a bunch of money and push a bunch of woke propaganda down onto students. So seeing this change is critical because you have a bunch of people in charge of these institutions who know how corrupt they are and have made it their mission to go after them from day one.
Thank you, Auron. For a little while, I taught in university. First year, second year university students didn't know who Stalin was, didn't know who Mao Zedong was. It's just absolutely, I don't know, is amazing a word, but something's very wrong. Auron, but this is just like Christmas every day. I can't even believe my eyes and ears in terms of what we're watching every day. And now they're going at the IRS. I personally have been tossing and turning since I was 9, 10 years old, just thinking about the JFK assassination, reading almost every book on it. I just can't wait for these files to finally be released. And also MLK files are going to, RFK, his brother, RFK, that assassination, they're going to release 9/11 files, the UFO files. It's just a fascinating time. And they really mean business. Annie Cyrus, what do you think about this discussion so far?
Definitely fascinating. I'm learning a lot. But I do have a question, or maybe a question. Could it be that we went through the last 4 years of our lives, in America specifically, because through lack of education, lack of family, faith, church, everything you mentioned, maybe our fellow Americans have actually forgotten the definition of freedom. As someone who I came to America when I was 18, that puts it almost 23 years ago, and I actually tangibly had to learn what freedoms mean because I come from Iran. Some people call it Iran. For me, freedom was to be allowed to wake up and breathe. That was freedom, right? But then here I had to take 3-4 years to learn the definition of given freedoms in America. But I feel like some Americans or majority of Americans have forgotten what the definition of freedoms, liberty, one nation under God, because all of that is fading away. What do you think of that?
Well, again, I believe that liberty is really our key word here, and the context, like you're talking about, is critical. A lot of Americans will parrot words about freedom, but then when it came to the pandemic, freedom suddenly shifted, right? Freedom became freedom to not get infected, freedom to not be around people who were sick, right? The word freedom seems to suddenly morph and change radically given the situation. And that's why I think it's so important, like you said, to understand that liberty is something that is a value that emanates from the nature of the people, the culture, and the traditions that they have. It's not something that you simply randomly throw around anytime people try to change the definition. These are rights that exist because they come from the practices, the cultures, the understanding that we had for many generations. And so when you come to the United States and you join that, you're understanding that you're weaving yourself into this shared tradition, this shared understanding of what liberty should be. But many Americans, like you said, don't understand that because they've been removed from all of the contexts in which they would practice an ordered liberty. They don't have the faith, they don't have the family, they don't have the church, they don't have the community. Liberty is about being able to take action, but it's just action in service of the good. And if you don't have that understanding of the good, if you do not have the church and the family and the community to ground you, then it just becomes freedom for what? Freedom for who? You don't have any context for that answer. And so I think that's why it's so critical for Americans to know their history, to know their Constitution, to know what the founders actually believe, not just what you learn in school, and to understand that all of that exists in the context of your duty to your family, your friends, your community. Because if you don't have those things, that's where the government steps in. The reason the government is teaching your children, the reason that the government is deciding what every public space looks like, the reason that the government is dictating what the media is telling you is because you have opened up all of these opportunities by ceding those responsibilities to the government. If you take those responsibilities onto yourself, if your community is the one educating, if your community is the one that is raising your children, if it's you and your family and the people you love who is influencing them directly with your values and the truth, then they are much more resilient to the type of propaganda that the state is pushing down on them.
Exactly. And let me tie this into my next maybe question. Um, we, the people, are supposed to be the bosses in this country. We run the country by hiring the right people and, holding them accountable or fire them, hire them again, whatever the case might be. But I feel like for last, let's say, 16 to 18 years, there is this hamster wheel that we're stuck in. We get Obama in to come in, open the door for Muslim Brotherhood, destroy our economy, crash the market, all of that. And then we get Trump to come in, rush through 4 years to fix as much as he can. Then we get Biden to come in. You see where I'm going with this? It's like, what are we doing, or what should we be doing as Americans, as we the people, to stop this cycle of the good guy fixing, the next guy destroying, the next guy fixing? We gotta stop this rotation. What is there to do for us?
Well, this might be a controversial statement by me, but I do believe it's true, and it's something I explore in the book in detail. I think popular sovereignty is ultimately a misunderstanding and somewhat a myth. Democracy was supposed to be a limited influence inside our government. Our founding fathers understood what many ancient thinkers understood, from Polybius to Aristotle to even Machiavelli, that the mixed constitution was the best form of government. And the mixed constitution took a little bit of everything, right? It had a little bit of aristocracy, a little bit of monarchy, a little bit of democracy, and it mixed them together. And so that's why in our original constitution, only 1/2 of 1/3 of the government was actually directly elected by the American people. The reason that they did that is that, you can read through many different founding fathers who were very skeptical of mass democracy. They wanted an influence from the people, but they did not want the entire government to operate in mass democracy. And the reason for that is they understood that the mob is very easily manipulated. And what I outline in the book is that once we got the technology of mass communication, we got propaganda. And propaganda allowed our oligarchic class, our managerial class, to manipulate the popular opinion and therefore the popular sovereignty. And this is what has allowed, especially the left, for a very long time to continue to project power, whether it's in or out of official power in the United States, because it's controlled the media, it's controlled the educational institutions, it's controlled the cultural institutions in the United States. And so even when someone like George Bush, or if Mitt Romney had been elected, or even Donald Trump in his first term actually get into office, we saw the battle that Donald Trump had to put up with the media, the deep state, all of these unelected federal bureaucrats who are constantly pushing back against him and denying his orders. He had to constantly battle against these things because they were part of this perpetuated class that was elevated through the propaganda created by the media, educational institutions, and such. And so I think something that is very difficult that we're going to have to address is that we need an increase in localization, and we need a way to resist this propaganda that has baked itself into our institutions. Now, I think a big part of that is doing what Trump is doing now, which is, again, ripping out much of that managerial class from these ensconced bureaucracies that are used to manipulate voters, right? Even when you look at the immigration policy of the United States, we basically had open borders under Biden because what the left was planning was they could bring in as many foreign members into the United States as possible, and hopefully they would vote for the Democratic Party, and this would manipulate our elections long term. So 20, 30 years from now, all of these people who were given birthright citizenship and the right to vote would completely shift the electoral status of the United States to the left. Now, hopefully that changes. We've seen that, for instance, Hispanics voted a lot more for Donald Trump than the left believed he would. And so ultimately, that bet may not be as secure as the left made it, but we can see the way in which they were willing to destroy the country in very real ways in order to manipulate public opinion and manipulate the vote. And that is something we have to be vigilant of. We can't have a republic in which one party can control the voting apparatus, who comes in, who's eligible, and what is being produced in Hollywood, the media, all of this stuff. Because if they do, then they will functionally be a one-party state. And that is, of course, the total state.
Well, thank you for answering my questions. I could continue this discussion with you for another hour, but this is Jamie's show. Thank you, Jamie, for letting me come in.
Well, always a pleasure, Annie. Thank you so much. And we can't have wonderful guests like Auron without our sponsors. So we're going to take a sponsor break.
I'm excited to announce that we're having our first ever mega sale on overstock clearance and brand new products. For example, save over 50% on this season's flannel sheets. Queen size only $59.98. Kings only $69.98. They sell out fast every year, so order now. Save 20% on our brand new My Crosses. They're designed in the likeness of the one I've worn every day for over 20 years. They come in men's and women's, and they're made right here in the USA. Get our 2025 six-piece My Towel sets for only $29.98. Our initial quantities are extremely low, so get them now before they go. And our best-selling standard My Pillows, just $14.98. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use this promo code to take advantage of our first ever mega sale. But wait, remember that $75 free shipping rule? Well, that ship is sailed because right now, every order ships absolutely free.
And that's right. Make sure to go to mypillow.com or mystore.com and use promo code GG21. You can get a discount of up to 60% off all the amazing products, and you're going to be helping Mike Lindell as well as the Glazov Gang. And if you like one-of-a-kind handmade art, make sure to go to lutfstudio.com and purchase resin art pieces made by the one and only our producer, Annie Cyrus. Use promo code GLAZOF to get special discounts. You're going to be helping out the Glazov Gang as well as Annie Cyrus. We are back with Auron MacIntyre. Auron, how are your pillows doing?
Pretty well, pretty well.
Do you have a My Pillow?
No, but I need to. I actually met like Mike Lindell briefly one time
Okay.
when we were at an event. It was a very nice guy, at least the amount I was able to talk to him. But I need to acquire the pillow. I need to pull the trigger on.
Okay. Well, we're going to work on that. Auron, let's talk a little bit about everything going on around us. You had any thoughts about the Super Bowl or the halftime performance? Kendrick Lamar, anything there interested you?
I'll be honest. I'm the American football fan that enjoys just watching my team. So I'm a Bucks fan. I was born in Tampa Bay, and so they were after the first round of playoffs. They were out. I watched the Super Bowl because kind of everybody watches the Super Bowl. But I immediately skipped the halftime show because I was just like, this is going to be garbage. And from everything I heard, I made the right choice because, from everything I heard, it was just boring. Like, it wasn't offensive. It's not, a lot of the halftime shows have been, trying to be scandalous or pushing the boundaries. From what I heard, this one was just boring. It was just dull.
Yeah. And why do you think that that's happening in our culture? Even when you say, oh, it's going to be garbage, there's something going on. Whenever there's these halftime shows or whatever, there's always some kind of satanic symbolism or something very inappropriate or dark going on. Something's going on there, right?
Well, our entire culture at this point has been designed to deconstruct, right? America is built, as we pointed out repeatedly, on Christian values. And it's my belief, and I explain this in the book, that the right thrives on these kind of natural axioms, these fundamental truths. And the left thrives on breaking those down. That's where its political power comes from. They are an entropic force. They want to go from a state of order to a state of chaos. And so in the process of moving from order to chaos, that's where the left gains its power. So for instance, one of God's truths is that there are only men and women. But the left wants to deconstruct that truth so they can create political drama and political power. When there's only men and women, there's no power for the left there. But if you can throw those definitions into chaos, if you can deconstruct them, then the left generates power and it becomes a greater force in our political struggle. And so the reason I think that the halftime show and most of our cultural entertainment today is built on these kind of symbols, being salacious, pushing the envelope, bringing in, satanic imagery and others, is because ultimately they're trying to deconstruct the remaining Christian culture of the United States. And I think that's why we're going to continue to see them push against that. It's losing, I think, a lot of its dynamism. They've already gone through so much. They've tried to deconstruct so much that it feels like there's diminishing returns on this. Like I said, people are just bored by this more than anything, I think. But it's still the only thing they know how to do. They don't know how to create the beautiful. They only know how to break it down.
Absolutely. And they want to destroy the beauty of America. They want to destroy beauty. Auron, we've got ICE trying to do its job now with Tom Homan leading them and to get rid of these illegals and to track them down. And there's leaks now. And we thought, is it the media? Is it this and this? And if I am correct, Tom Homan has even confirmed that some of these leaks are originating from the FBI. So this is very interesting. The FBI is trying to stop the new government from grabbing illegals and getting them out of here. What do you think of that?
Well, it just confirms what I think anybody who's paying attention already knew, which is the FBI is a criminal organization. It's an organization that has basically turned itself into the Praetorian Guard for our leftist regime. It doesn't exist to serve the American people. It doesn't exist to serve our safety. It exists to serve the Democratic Party. It's the military arm of the Democratic Party. It's an armed force for them. And so even when they are under the duly elected authority of the President of the United States, when he's the chief executive and therefore able to dictate the terms in which they should be operating, they are still pushing back and fighting back against him, which again, why is it so important to put someone like Kash Patel in charge of this? Because this is a guy who understands the corruption, understands the type of hatred that many of these FBI agents are bringing towards the president and his voters. And he knows what to push against. And we're talking about a force that surveilled traditional Catholics, which arrested people for protesting against abortion, which went ahead and threatened parents who were protesting against the gender ideology being taught in their schools. Does that sound like a force that is actually caring about the well-being of the United States? No, it sounds like the secret police in a totalitarian state. And that's because that is what they have become. And that's why they need to either be radically reformed or just entirely dismantled.
Absolutely. Look what they did to General Michael Flynn. And Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller were at this event where they were, trying to support freedom of expression and freedom of speech within the context of Islam, and that there should be freedom of expression. And some jihadists, tried to come and shoot it up. And thank God there was a security guard there. But we know it turned out that there was an FBI agent who was undercover or whatever and was pretending that he was on the jihadist side, but he was cheering them on, telling them go and tear this place up. It would be great if we could find out the truth behind that, because that's been covered up. So that's very interesting. And also, I'm not too sure that the FBI was doing this incredible investigation to find out what happened to whistleblower Phil Haney. Do you know anything about that? Because it seems like that was very, very kind of covered up investigation. I mean, overall, the FBI is not really, under Biden, definitely not looking out for the American people.
Well, and they're far from the only organization that's like this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just look at the Secret Service. We saw what happened with Donald Trump, a shooter who had no business being on an unguarded roof at that distance. He was known to be a threat. He was able to get a relatively clear shot of, basically the leading presidential candidate at the time. And then there was another assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And it's just very clear that either the Secret Service is comically inept or there was something intentional happening there. And the questions are still there. We barely know anything about the attempted assassins of the president of the United States. We've heard very little publicly about their political beliefs, what motivated them, how they got to where they are. And the question is, are we ever going to hear that? Are we ever going to know what really happened? Was there an intentional lack of attention towards Donald Trump during his protection detail? Or were they just really that inept? Was it the fact that they just put a bunch of people in there who obviously were second or third string agents at best, and they allowed something that no actual well-trained vigilant agent would allow? We don't know. And until we know these things, it's very difficult to trust these institutions. And again, that's why it's so critical that Trump puts people who are hostile towards these institutions at the head of these institutions, because everyone inside of them, all of the agents, all of the actors, are deeply invested in keeping these issues hidden. And if you don't have people who are hostile towards that, if you have people who are instead trying to ingratiate themselves with these institutions, then we're never going to find out what happened.
Absolutely. Remember under Obama, ISIS is just out in the fields on their vans, and they're just driving up and down, and they've what they did to the Yazidis and continue to do, and nothing's being done. And then Trump comes in, and within a blink of an eye, he decimates ISIS. So you got to ask yourself, what was Obama doing that whole time? And so now Trump gets in, talks to Putin on the phone, blah, blah, blah. Now, in terms of Russia and Ukraine, sounds like something's going to be done very, very quickly in terms of ending that war. All of a sudden, the American teacher, Mark Fogel, is coming back or has come back. Then Trump's new ideas about Gaza and saying what Egypt and Jordan needs to do. A lot is happening. You got to ask yourself, what was Biden or whoever's behind him, because obviously he wasn't the person leading the country, what were the Democrats doing for 4 years? What do you think about all this? Russia, Ukraine, the teacher coming back from Russia, just moving at a very fast pace, but it's exposing the people that were in power, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that the United States foreign policy is not operated in the interest of the American people. For a very long time, we've been operating a scenario in which the Department of the Defense couldn't imagine a scenario where it would defend the actual borders of the United States. It was far more interested in the borders of Ukraine or Israel or whatever other country that it was currently obsessed with. And it's really important that we shift that focus back to being America first, being about what benefits American citizens and our security. Ukraine, again, I'm sure Vladimir Putin isn't a great guy. I certainly wouldn't want to live under his governance, but it's just not our problem. It's not our business. That is a problem between him and his neighbors. The idea that we should extend our military alliances all the way to Russia's border as if that somehow helps America, it just doesn't hold water. And so obviously we were perpetuating a war for the interests of a class of people who profit off of continuing to funnel money through defense contractors, NGOs, and other organizations. And we were doing that just because we had the option of possibly getting Russia to expend a lot of people and munitions in that effort. I think that's deeply immoral. If you're going to fight a war with Russia, then fight it. If you're not, then don't. Certainly don't try to fund a proxy war and kill every Ukrainian man in an attempt to throw them at the Russian forces. I'm really glad that ultimately Donald Trump recognizes the importance of, again, making America's foreign policy work for us. He wants the Europeans to take on more and more of their own responsibility for their own defense. Pay your own costs. Put your own troops in harm's way. Do not just assume that we are your bank that you can always just withdraw from anytime you decide to get in some kind of foreign policy conflict. The United States will have allies and assist them when it is in our interests, and it will focus on our borders and the well-being of our people. And that's what the European nations should be doing as well. They should not be assuming that the United States is going to step in and carry the burden of NATO or any of these other alliances for them. If they're very worried about Russia's expansion, they should prepare a military deterrence against it and stop expecting the United States to be the one that is handling that for them.
Thank you, Auron. When you spoke of virtue and we talked about virtue, it's interesting when you see these, I would call them demons, how they're just in ferocious, seething rage against what Trump is doing. And so, I always wondered, like, if you just turn the volume off, put it on mute, and just show a pro-choice demonstration and there's pro-lifers, you just put it on mute, you just look at their physical appearance and how they're acting, it's not too difficult to know which side is what side, right? And so when you look at, Schumer and Maxine Waters and how they're yelling at that protest about Trump, and even what they're saying, like, we have this pastor, quote unquote, that's been calling for violence against Musk. Now we have this Democratic congresswoman. They were at this rally or whatever, and they're saying F Trump. Why is it always, when you look at the left, there's always this kind of vulgarity coming out of their mouth? There's always something, it's always dirty. It's always foul.
Well, again, they feel the need to be transgressive, right? It's about the revolution. It's about dismantling. It's about entropic, degradation of order. This is how they operate on a regular basis. So what else are you going to say, right? Trump is bringing order in these scenarios. He's bringing order to foreign policy. He's bringing order to domestic policy. He's restoring the authority, the rightful constitutional authority under Article 2 of the president. But this is exactly the opposite of what the left wants to see. They want this order to be degraded. They want this power to be put in the hands of the managerial class, into these unelected bureaucrats, into these globalist organizations that are making decisions without the input of the American people. This is what they want. And so when they see someone like Trump who's trying to restore that order back, they become furious because that is the exact opposite of their goal. They want to disassemble and distribute that authority so that it can be manipulated. They don't want someone like Trump to step back in and say, I understand how the American Constitution is supposed to work. I understand how the American government is supposed to work. And I want to restore us back to that state.
Can you imagine being in a rage that there's an audit of how American taxpayers' money is being spent? Like this is what they're upset about, that there's they're looking into how our money's being spent, right?
Yeah, of course, these people, it's important to understand how much of the federal government is just a leftist patronage network, right? These people do believe in their ideas, but ultimately they're fighting with this passion because they get paid, right? They make money off of this. They are paying their salaries with these handouts. Look at all of the U.S. aid, the USAID that got unraveled when we saw what happened once Elon and Doge actually started to audit what was going on there. All of the different evil projects, transgender comic books in Peru, and transgender operas in Colombia, and spreading atheism in Nepal. Like these are not. It's not just taking Americans' money. That would be bad enough, but it's channeling it towards truly evil things. Like Americans have had a evil empire funded in their name. And that is just a terrible thing to behold. So it's so important that people understand that as we start to unravel, not just that USAID, but the Department of Education, when we look at the Department of Defense, when the IRS and all of these things, the FBI, they're screaming because they know the amount of graft and corruption, greed that is wrapped up in all of this. They know where the payments are going, and they do not want that exposed.
Wow. Annie Cyrus, any final thoughts from you on our show this evening?
Thoughts? Yes. This has been amazing. I'm learning a lot. But on the very last thing you just said, so on January 30th, Elizabeth Warren said the following: there is nothing in the Constitution that says ordinary Americans have a right to see what we are spending tax dollars on. Is that true?
No, of course not. But that's the beauty of it, right? They don't care. They don't care if it's true. They just assert it. They expect the media to come up behind them and clean up their mess for them. But more and more Americans are seeing the truth. It's beautiful because Trump was doing so much early on that they didn't know what to do, right? They didn't know where to plant their feet or how to push back. And they decided that the first place they were going to do that was USAID. And then you see this Streisand effect where everyone starts saying, oh, well, what is this money doing? What are we doing with this money? And then you find out all these terrible things. And again, that's only the beginning of the iceberg. That's why these Democrats are saying you don't have the right to know what's going on with your own money, because they know that that is just the very, very tip of what they are up to. And once the truth really unravels, it's going to be a horrible scandal. It already is, and it's only going to get worse for them.
Yes, but I would say there is possibly a good thing coming out of this. The more these leftists out there, or rhinos for that matter, are screaming it's unconstitutional, this is not in the Constitution, I think Americans are actually finally picking up a copy of the Constitution and reading it, which is great.
As a former teacher of the Constitution, I certainly support that.
Fantastic. We are out of time, but we got maybe 2 minutes left. Auron, how would you like to end this program?
I just want to say thank you for having me on. It's been great talking to both of you. And if people want to pick up the book, they can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, or even better, order it from your own local bookstore. I've also got a show over at The Blaze along with the column, and you can find it on all your favorite podcast platforms as well as YouTube and Rumble.
Right. So everybody get the total state, how liberal democracies become tyrannies. You have the Auron MacIntyre show, right? And that's on Rumble. And where else?
It's on Blaze TV. And of course, you can get it on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, all of those different places where you have the podcast.
Okay, fantastic. Auron, it was an honor and privilege to have you on the show. Thank you for your truth telling and for opening our eyes to the truths about how to protect liberty and how to fight for liberty. Thank you so much.
Thanks again, guys.
Thank you. Thank you for joining the Glazov Gang. Make sure to get Auron MacIntyre's book, The Total State. We'll see you soon. Good night.